The road begins where you least expect it, in the shadow of a grain elevator that has not seen a single kernel of wheat in 30 years. The elevator stands like a tombstone at the edge of a town that is no longer on any map, a place called something like Aldrich or Verona or maybe just a crossroad with no name at all. The pavement is cracked and buckled, and the white line that once guided travelers has faded to a ghost of itself. If you blink, you will miss the turn. There is no sign that says historic route, no plaque, no visitor center. Just a narrow strip of asphalt that disappears into a horizon of endless prairie grass and sky. This is the forgotten highway across North Dakota, and most people who live in the state have never driven it. The interstate carries them from Fargo to Bismarck in 4 hours, air conditioning humming, coffee in hand, the landscape a blur of amber waves and combine harvesters. But the old road takes all day, and it gives you nothing but silence, a silence that is louder than any engine. I first heard about this highway from an old man in a diner in Washburn. He was sitting at the counter, drinking coffee from a thick ceramic mug that had the name of a bank that went under in 1983. I asked him if he knew any good drives in the area, and he laughed, a dry chuckle that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. He said there is one road you ought to see, but you need a full tank of gas and a full day of time, and you better not be in a hurry. He called it the Wagon Road, but the official name was the Old Red Trail. He said it was part of the first transcontinental auto route, the one that sent thousands of Model T Fords trundling across the Great Plains in the 19-teens and 20s. It was a dirt track then, mud when it rained, dust when it did not. But it was the only way to go from Minneapolis to the West Coast, and people took it because they had no choice. They drove for days, sleeping in tents or in the cars themselves, cooking over campfires, fixing flat tires with tools that weighed more than their luggage. The old man told me that his father drove that road in 1917 when he was just a boy, and he remembered the ruts so deep that the car would bottom out on the high spots. He remembered the sound of the wind, constant and unforgiving, and the feeling of being completely alone in a world that seemed to have no end. I asked him if the road still existed, and he said yes mostly, but you have to know where to look. He drew a map on a napkin, a series of straight lines and right angles that looked like a child's drawing of a maze. He said follow the grain elevators, and when you come to a water tower that is painted yellow instead of the usual white, turn left. He said you will know you have found the old road when the pavement turns to gravel, and then the gravel turns to dirt, and then the dirt turns to grass. That is where the history lives. I set out the next morning, leaving Washburn behind and heading west along the Missouri River. The interstate is a 4-lane divided highway that cuts through the Badlands like a scar, but I wanted no part of it. I took a county road that ran parallel to the river, past farms that had been in the same families for 100 years, past barns that were listing to one side, past fields of sunflowers that turned their heads to follow the sun like pilgrims in a procession. I passed a sign that said historical marker ahead, and I pulled over. The marker was small, made of bronze, and it was bolted to a concrete post that had been painted over so many times that the words were hard to read. It said simply, The Old Red Trail, 1911 to 1926. There was a short paragraph underneath, explaining that this was the route of the first transcontinental automobile highway, but the details were sparse. It did not mention the people who had died trying to cross this country, the families who had lost everything when their cars broke down in the middle of nowhere, the towns that had risen and fallen along this ribbon of soil. The marker was a skeleton of a story, the bones without the flesh. I got back in the car and drove on. The county road turned to gravel after about 10 miles, just as the old man had predicted. The gravel was coarse and white, crushed limestone from a quarry that had closed in the 1950s, and it pinged against the undercarriage of my car like 1,000 tiny bells. The dust rose behind me in a cloud that lingered in the still air, a marker of my passage that would be gone within an hour. The landscape opened up, the river valley giving way to rolling hills covered in shortgrass that looked like the hide of an animal. I saw a herd of pronghorn antelope in a field, their white rumps flashing as they ran, and I stopped the car to watch them. They ran in a line, graceful and fast, and then they stopped and turned to look at me. For a moment, we were the only two moving things in the world, the pronghorn and I, and the road between us was a line that connected the past to the present. I thought about the drivers who had seen the same sight 100 years ago, the same antelope, the same grass, the same sky. They would have stopped too, maybe to rest, maybe to eat, maybe just to take in the vastness of it all. They would have felt the same awe, the same smallness, the same sense that they were traveling through something older than any map. The gravel road forked, and I remembered the old man's instructions. Take the left fork, the one that goes past the yellow water tower. The water tower was still there, rusting at the edges, the yellow paint peeling in strips. It had a sign on it that said the name of a town that no longer existed, a town with a population of 0. The road beyond the tower was dirt, not gravel, and it was narrow, barely wide enough for one car. Weeds grew tall in the center of the road, brushing against the bottom of my car as I drove. The dirt was hard-packed, baked by the sun and the wind, and it had the color of brick. I drove slowly, because the road was full of dips and ruts, the ghost of the original track that had been worn by the wheels of Model Ts and horse-drawn wagons. Every few hundred feet, I could see where the road had been repaired, patches of asphalt from the 193s, then gravel from the 1960s, then nothing but dirt. It was like reading a timeline of transportation technology in the cracks of the pavement. I came to a bridge, a one-lane structure made of steel and wood, with a sign that said maximum load 5 tons. The bridge spanned a dry creek bed, a wash that had not seen water in years. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and got out. The wood creaked under my feet and the steel groaned. I looked down into the dry creek, and I saw the remains of an old car, a Ford Model T, its chassis rusted and twisted, its wheels long gone. The car was half buried in the silt, and it had been there for so long that a cottonwood tree had grown up through the engine compartment, its roots wrapping around the block like fingers. The tree was about as old as the car, maybe 40 years, maybe 50. I wondered what had happened to the people in that car. Had they broken down and walked to the nearest town, leaving the vehicle to be claimed by the prairie? Had they died out here, the victims of a blizzard or a breakdown? There was no marker, no cross, no story to tell. The car was just another piece of the landscape, another artifact of a time when this road was the only connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific. I got back in the car and drove on. The dirt road continued for another 20 miles, and I saw no other cars. I saw no houses, no farms, no signs of human life except for the occasional fence post and a windmill that had stopped turning long ago. The wind was constant, as the old man had said, and it whistled through the cracks in the car windows, a sound that was haunting and lonely. I thought about the people who had traveled this road in the early days of the automobile, the pioneers of the highway. They were not the well-to-do tourists of the later era, driving on paved roads with motels every few miles. They were ordinary people, farmers and salesmen and families who were trying to go from one place to another in a machine that was unreliable and slow. They carried spare tires, cans of gas, and a lot of courage. They traveled in convoys sometimes because it was safer, but often they traveled alone, and when they broke down, they relied on the kindness of strangers. There were stories of travelers who were rescued by ranchers, who fed them and gave them a bed for the night. There were also stories of travelers who were never found, who vanished into the prairie without a trace, their cars found weeks later abandoned by the side of the road. The old red trail was not just a road. It was a lifeline for the towns that dotted the prairies, tiny settlements that existed solely to serve the travelers. There was a town every 10 or 15 miles, each one with a gas station, a cafe, a hotel, and a garage. These towns were born because of the road, and they died when the road died. When the interstate was built in the 1960s and 1970s, bypassing the winding two-lane highways, the towns withered. The gas stations closed, the cafes turned into boarded-up shells, the hotels became abandoned ruins. The road itself was left to decay, narrow and dangerous, and eventually it was taken off the official state map. It became a county road, then a dirt track, then a memory. But the towns are still there if you know where to look. They are the skeletons of the American dream, the bones of a highway that once was the most important road in the country. I came to one such town about an hour after crossing the bridge. The town was called something like Zenith or Regent, a name that conjured images of grandeur, but was now just a few buildings lining a single street. There was a general store with a faded sign advertising Coca-Cola in a font from the 1920s. There was a church with a steeple that leaned to the left, as if it were trying to escape the weight of the sky. There was a post office that had been closed for decades, its flagpole empty, its mail slot rusted shut. The only sign of life was a dog, a mangy mutt with a limp, who watched me from the porch of the general store. The dog did not bark. It just stared, as if it had been waiting for someone to come for a long time. I got out of the car and walked to the general store. The door was unlocked, and inside I found a dimly lit room with shelves that were mostly bare. There was an old man sitting behind the counter, reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. He looked up when I came in and nodded. He asked me if I was lost, and I said no, I was looking for the old road. He laughed, a dry sound like the old man in Washburn. He said, "You found it. This is all that is left." The road ends about a mile past the church, and after that it is just ruts in the grass. But if you walk a little, you can still see the white line in the gravel, the last paint from the 1950s. He said people come here sometimes, looking for what was lost. They take pictures, they walk the road. They leave and they do not come back. I bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips, and I sat on the porch of the store, watching the dog watch me. The wind blew and the door of the store creaked, and I thought about all the drivers who had stopped at the same store 100 years ago for the same water and the same rest. The old man came out and sat in a rocking chair next to me. He pointed to the church and said that was where the travelers used to stay sometimes if the hotel was full. He said they would sleep in the pews, and the preacher would give them breakfast in the morning. He said his grandfather used to work in the garage, fixing tires and patching radiators, and he remembered stories about a family from Pennsylvania who had a breakdown here in 1909. The family had 3 children, and they stayed for a week while the car was repaired. The children played with the local kids, and the mother helped in the kitchen, and when they finally left, everyone in town came out to wave goodbye. They never heard from them again. But his grandfather used to say that the road connected them all, the families from the east and the families from the west, and that the road itself was a living thing, a thread that bound the country together. I left the town and drove to where the road ended. The old man was right. About a mile past the church, the dirt turned to grass, and the grass was full of ruts, 2 parallel lines that curved and dipped across the prairie like a snake. I got out and walked. The ruts were deep enough that you could see the path even after 100 years of grazing cattle and growing weeds. I followed them for a mile or so until I came to a point where the ruts split in 2, one set going south and the other going north. This was a fork in the historical road, and I had no idea which way to go. I stood there in the middle of the grass, with the wind in my ears and the sun beating down on my face, and I realized that the forgotten highway was not just a road. It was a story, told in layers of concrete and dirt, in the bones of towns and the memories of old men. It was a story that was still being told, one traveler at a time. And as I stood there, I knew that the only way to understand it was to keep walking, to keep following the ruts, to see where they led, because the road does not end. It just becomes something else. It becomes a path through history, a path that is waiting for anyone who has the time and the curiosity to walk it. I chose the southern fork, not because it looked more promising, but because the sky seemed to hang lower in that direction, a slate-gray ceiling that promised nothing and everything all at once. The ruts were faint here, nearly erased by time, but the prairie itself seemed to remember the path. The grass grew differently along the old roadbed, a slightly different shade of green, a slightly different texture, as if the ground itself was marked by the passage of all those tires and all those feet. I walked for perhaps an hour, the only sound the whisper of my boots through the grass and the eternal wind that carried the scent of sage and dust and something else, something ancient and nameless. I thought about the travelers who had taken this same fork a century ago, how they must have felt a mix of relief and dread when they saw the road splitting before them. Which way led to safety? Which way led to the next town, the next meal, the next chance at survival? There were no road signs then, not really. There were only the words of a stranger at the previous stop, a hand-drawn map on a scrap of paper, or the simple instinct that told a man to go south when the sun was high and west when the sun was low. I came to a place where the ruts disappeared entirely, swallowed by a shallow depression that had once been a slough but was now just a dry bowl of cracked mud. I stood at the edge of this natural basin and looked out across the vastness of the prairie, and I realized that I had been walking for nearly 2 hours without seeing a single sign of human presence. No fence posts, no power lines, no distant rooftops, just the grass and the sky and the wind in me. It was a strange feeling, both terrifying and liberating, to be so utterly alone in a place that had once been a highway. I sat down on the edge of the slough and took off my boots to empty the sand that had accumulated inside. The wind whipped around me, and I closed my eyes, and I tried to imagine what it sounded like 100 years ago. I imagined the rumble of engines, the honking of horns, the voices of families arguing over which direction to take. I imagined the laughter of children chasing each other across the prairie while their parents fixed a flat tire. I imagined a young woman writing a postcard in the shade of a car, describing to her mother back east the endless sky and the strange, beautiful loneliness of this place. When I opened my eyes, I saw something glinting in the dry mud, a flash of light that caught the sun for just a moment. I stood up and walked to the spot, and I knelt down and brushed away the dried mud with my fingers. It was a coin, a silver dollar from 1902, worn smooth by time and weather but still bearing the outline of Lady Liberty. I held it in my palm, and I felt a connection to the person who had dropped it here decades ago. Maybe it was a farmer heading west, his pockets full of the money he had saved from selling his land in Minnesota. Maybe it was a salesman who had stopped to fix a tire and had reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, the coin slipping out unnoticed. Or maybe it was a child, like the ones I had imagined, who had found the coin somewhere else and lost it while running through the grass. I put the coin in my pocket, and I felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the road had given me a gift, a token of its long and storied history. I decided to walk a little further, even though the ruts were gone. I followed the natural line of the land, staying low where a road would have followed the contour, and I came to a small rise. From the top, I could see for miles in every direction. The prairie was a sea of gold and green, with islands of darker vegetation where the draws held a little more moisture. I scanned the horizon for any sign of a town, a farm, a road, anything. And there, far to the south, I thought I saw a faint line of trees, a row of tall cottonwoods that seemed out of place, as if they had been planted deliberately. I knew that in the history of the Great Plains, trees were markers of human habitation. They were planted as windbreaks, as shade for a house, as a sign that someone had claimed this piece of land and intended to stay. I walked toward the trees, and the walk took another hour, but the trees never seemed to get closer. They shimmered in the heat haze, dancing on the edge of vision, a mirage that I both believed and doubted. Finally, I reached the trees. They were not a mirage. They were a windbreak, a row of stately old cottonwoods that stretched in a straight line for nearly a quarter of a mile. At the base of the trees, I found the foundation of a house, a rectangle of stones that had once supported a wooden structure. The house was gone, collapsed or burned or simply dismantled years ago, but the foundation remained, a ghost of a home. I stepped over the stones and stood where the living room might have been, where a family might have gathered around a stove on a winter night. There was a depression in the ground that might have been a cellar or a root cellar, and I knelt to examine it. Inside, I found a few shards of glass, the neck of a bottle, a rusted hinge, and a child's shoe, the leather cracked and brittle, the sole nearly gone. I picked up the shoe and held it, and I thought about the child who had worn it, who had run through this very spot 100 years ago. The shoe was small, meant for a child of perhaps 5 or 6. I wondered what had happened to that child. Did they grow up, leave the farm, and move to the city? Did they stay and raise their own family on this same spot? Or did they die young, a victim of the diseases that swept through the prairie homesteads with terrifying regularity? I sat down on the foundation and looked out at the landscape. This farm, this house, had been built along the old red trail. The travelers would have passed by this very house, maybe stopping for water or directions. The family who lived here would have seen the parade of American ambition, the endless stream of wagons and cars and trucks moving west. They would have waved to the travelers, maybe shouted a greeting, maybe offered a meal. And then when the interstate bypassed the old road, the travelers stopped coming. The house fell into disrepair, the family left or died, and the prairie reclaimed the land. But the cottonwoods remained, a testament to the human desire to put down roots, to create a place in the vast and indifferent sea of grass. I stayed there for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the wind shift as the afternoon wore on. I ate the bag of chips and drank half the water, and I thought about the thousands of people who had passed through this place, each with their own story, their own hopes and fears and dreams. The road was not just a physical path. It was a repository of all those stories, a living archive of hope and disappointment, of triumph and tragedy, of the simple human desire to move, to explore, to find a better life. And I realized that my own story was now part of that archive. I was not just a visitor to the forgotten highway. I was a traveler on it, a character in its long and winding narrative. I stood up and brushed the dust from my clothes. I decided to follow the line of cottonwoods, which seemed to run southwest, parallel to the old road. The trees were spaced about 20 feet apart, their branches stretching out to embrace the sky. I walked in their shadow, grateful for the relief from the sun, and I came to a place where the row ended abruptly, where a modern gravel road intersected the line of trees. The gravel road was old too, but it was still maintained, the gravel graded and the ditches cleared. I stood at the intersection and looked west. The gravel road stretched into the distance, straight as a ruler, and I knew that it had been built on the bed of the old red trail. The state had not completely abandoned the road. They had simply downgraded it, turned it from a state highway into a county road, and then let it fade from memory. But the route was still there, a thin line of gravel threading through the prairie. I walked along the gravel road, my feet crunching on the stones, and I came to a bridge, a small concrete structure that spanned a dry creek. The bridge had a plaque on it, rusted but legible, that said it was built in 1937 by the Works Progress Administration. I stopped and touched the plaque, its surface rough and pitted. The men who built this bridge were out of work, desperate for a wage, and they had come here to the middle of nowhere to pour concrete and bend steel. They had built something that lasted, something that still carried the weight of travelers 80 years later. I thought about those men, their hands calloused and their backs bent, working under the same sun that beat down on me. They had no idea that the road they were building would one day be forgotten. They just did the work because that was what the country asked of them. I crossed the bridge and continued along the gravel road. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. I knew I had to find a place to sleep for the night, but I was not ready to leave the road. I walked faster, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. And then, about a mile ahead, I saw a structure, a small building that seemed to emerge from the grass like a ghost. I approached it cautiously, my heart beating a little faster. It was an old gas station, or what remained of one. The building was made of concrete blocks, its roof long gone, its windows empty sockets. There was a single pump in front, the kind with a glass globe on top, the glass broken and the metal rusted to a shade of deep brown. Above the pump, a sign hung from a single chain, swinging in the wind. The sign read gas, but the letters were faded to the point of invisibility from a distance. I walked around the building and found the remnants of a garage, the concrete floor cracked and weedy, the walls reduced to a single corner where the structure had collapsed. I sat down on the concrete floor of the garage and watched the sunset. The sky turned orange and pink and then a deep purple, and the stars began to appear, one by one, like lights being turned on in a vast and empty house. I was tired and hungry, and my water was almost gone, but I felt a strange sense of peace, as if I had finally arrived at a place I had been searching for my whole life. The forgotten highway had given me nothing but dust and silence and a few pieces of old junk, and yet it had given me everything. It had given me a sense of connection to the past, a sense of belonging to a story that was larger than my own. I lay down on the concrete, using my jacket as a pillow, and I looked up at the stars. The Milky Way was a river of light across the sky, so bright that I could see the dust lanes and the clusters of stars that astronomers call open clusters. I thought about the travelers who had slept under these same stars 100 years ago, how they must have felt a mix of wonder and fear, how they must have looked up at the same sky and wondered what the future held. I closed my eyes, and I listened to the wind, and I let the road carry me into sleep. I woke to the sound of a car. It was a distant sound, a low hum that grew louder, and I sat up, disoriented for a moment. The sun was just rising, casting a golden light across the prairie. I saw a pickup truck coming down the gravel road, trailing a cloud of dust. I stood up and waved, and the truck slowed and stopped. The driver was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time in the sun. She rolled down the window and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes, I was just traveling, following the old road. She nodded as if she understood. She said her name was Mary, and she lived about 10 miles down the road. She said she did not see many people walking out here, and she asked if I wanted a ride. I got in the truck, and we drove along the gravel road, the tires kicking up stones that pinged against the undercarriage. Mary told me that her family had been in this area since the 1880s, that her great-grandfather had homesteaded a plot of land not far from the old gas station. She said she remembered when the old road was still paved, when the big cars with their shiny chrome would drive past her family's farm, and she and her siblings would wave at the tourists and sometimes get a candy bar thrown from a window. She said the road was a lifeline, a connection to the wider world, and when the interstate came, it was like a door closing. The town she grew up in, a place called Bentley, withered and died. The school closed, the store closed, the church closed. Her parents stayed, but most of the young people left, and now Bentley was nothing but a few houses and a grain elevator that had not been used in 30 years. I asked her if she ever thought about leaving. She laughed, a dry sound that reminded me of the old man in Washburn. She said she had thought about it many times, but the land was in her blood. She said the prairie was not a place you could leave easily. It got under your skin, into your bones, and it became part of you. She said she had traveled a little, visited her daughter in Minneapolis, gone to the coast once, but she always felt a pull to come back, to feel the wind on her face and see the horizon stretching to infinity. She said the road was part of that, the old road, even though it was now just gravel and memories. She said she sometimes drove the old route just to remember, to feel the way her father must have felt when he drove it as a young man. We drove in silence for a while, and I watched the landscape unfold through the window. The prairie was beautiful in the morning light, the grass shimmering with dew, the sky a pale blue that seemed to go on forever. We passed a few farms, the houses and barns spaced far apart, and I thought about the lives that were lived there, the cycles of planting and harvest, the long winters and the brief, intense summers. I asked Mary if she knew any more stories about the old road. She thought for a moment, and then she told me about a woman named Eleanor who had driven the road alone in 1923. Eleanor was from New York, a teacher who had taken a job in a small town in Montana, and she had decided to drive herself rather than take the train. She had no spare tire, no extra gas, and no map. She just had a destination and a determination. She broke down twice, once in South Dakota and once in North Dakota, and both times she was helped by strangers, a farmer who fixed her radiator and a mechanic who gave her a tire from his own car. She made it to Montana in 6 days, and she later wrote a letter to her sister describing the trip. Mary said the letter was printed in a local newspaper years ago, and she had a copy somewhere. She said Eleanor's story was a reminder that the road could be harsh, but it could also bring out the best in people. We arrived at Mary's farm, a cluster of buildings that included a white farmhouse, a red barn, and a few sheds. She invited me in for breakfast, and I accepted gratefully. We sat in her kitchen, a cozy room with a wood stove and lace curtains, and she made eggs and bacon and toast, and we drank coffee that was strong and black. She told me more about the history of the area, about the blizzards that had stranded travelers for days, about the droughts that had forced families off their land, about the small triumphs and the quiet sorrows of life on the prairie. She showed me a photograph album, pictures of her grandparents and great-grandparents, of the town of Bentley when it was still alive, of the old road when it was still a highway. The photographs were black and white, a little faded, but they were alive with the energy of a time that was long past. I saw cars from the 1920s and 30s lined up in front of the gas station, men in suits and hats, women in long dresses and cloche hats. I saw children playing in the street, their faces dirty and their smiles wide. I saw the road itself, a ribbon of gravel that stretched into the distance, and I felt a pang of loss for something I had never known. After breakfast, Mary showed me the letter from Eleanor, the teacher who had driven the road alone. It was a yellowed piece of paper, typed on an old typewriter, and it was full of the vivid language of someone who had survived an adventure. Eleanor wrote about the endless prairie, the strange quiet that could be both peaceful and terrifying, the kindness of strangers, the joy of finally arriving at her destination. She wrote that the road had taught her something about herself, about the strength she did not know she had. Mary told me that she kept the letter in a frame, that she read it sometimes when she felt lonely or discouraged. She said it reminded her that the road, even when it is forgotten, still has a power, still can teach us something about who we are and where we are going. I thanked Mary for her hospitality, and she gave me a ride back to where I had left my car, parked at the edge of the town with the leaning church. I stood by my car, the sun now high in the sky, and I looked at the road that was no longer a road. The wind was still blowing, the grass was still swaying, and the old man was still sitting on the porch of the general store, watching me with the same patient gaze. I knew that I could not stay forever, that I had to move on, but I also knew that the forgotten highway would stay with me. It was a part of my story now, a chapter that I would carry with me wherever I went. I started the engine and I drove away, following the gravel road south, knowing that the road was always there, waiting for the next traveler, the next story, the next person willing to walk its forgotten path. I drove south, the gravel road unwinding before me like a length of frayed rope. The sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, and the prairie opened up into a vast, unbroken expanse that seemed to swallow all sound. The engine of my car hummed a steady note, and the wind whistled through a crack in the window, a thin, mournful sound that felt like the voice of the road itself. I thought about Eleanor, the teacher from New York, and about Mary and her family, and about all the others who had traveled this path before me. I thought about the stories that were buried in the dust, the laughter and the tears, the departures and the homecomings. The road was a library of invisible books, and I was turning pages one by one. After about an hour, I came to a small sign, weathered and bent, that read Bentley, 2 miles. I had to look twice to see it because the letters were almost worn away and the post was leaning at a precarious angle. I slowed down and turned onto a narrow lane that led away from the gravel road, following a rutted track that was barely wide enough for my car. The lane curved through a field of wheat that was just beginning to turn gold, and then I saw the grain elevator Mary had mentioned. It stood alone against the sky, a wooden tower that had once been painted red but was now a faded, peeling gray. It was a monument to a time when Bentley was alive, when the harvests were hauled in and the trains came to take them away. Now it was just a skeleton, a reminder of what had been. I pulled up near the elevator and got out. The air was still and hot, and I could smell the dust and the dry grass. There were a handful of houses scattered around, most of them boarded up, their windows dark and empty. One house, however, had a car in the driveway, a late-model sedan, and a porch with a rocking chair that moved slightly in the breeze. I walked toward it, not sure what I was looking for, but feeling drawn by a curiosity that had become a constant companion. As I approached, a screen door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was probably in his 70s, with a thatch of white hair and glasses that were thick and round. He was holding a cup of coffee, and he looked at me with the same patient curiosity I had seen in the old man at the general store and in Mary. He said hello, and I introduced myself, and I explained that I was following the old highway. He nodded as if that explained everything. His name was Harold, and he had lived in Bentley his whole life, except for a few years when he went to college in Fargo. He came back after graduation to run the family farm, and he never left. He said he remembered when Bentley had a population of 300, when the school had 2 teachers and the store sold everything from nails to ice cream. He remembered the old road when it was still paved, when the cars would come through on Sunday afternoons, and he and his friends would sit on the curb and watch them pass. He said the road was like a river, flowing with stories and possibilities. But then the interstate came and the river dried up. The businesses closed one by one. The young people left. Now there were only a dozen or so residents, most of them elderly, and the town existed mostly in memory. Harold invited me to sit on the porch, and he brought me a glass of lemonade. He told me about the blizzard of 1952, when the snow drifted so high that it buried the first floor of his house, and he and his family had to climb out of a second-story window. He told me about the drought of the 1930s, when the dust storms turned the sky black and the land cracked like a broken plate. He told me about the celebrations, too, the 4th of July parades that went down the main street, the harvest festivals with pies and music and dancing. He said that the town had a soul, and that soul was tied to the road. When the road was forgotten, the town began to fade, but the soul never completely disappeared. It was still there in the wind, in the grass, in the stories that people like him carried. I asked Harold if he had any photographs or documents from the old days. He laughed and said he had boxes of them. He went inside and came back with a shoebox full of old postcards and letters. We sat on the porch and went through them together. There were postcards of the highway from the 1920s, showing cars parked in front of the Bentley gas station. The station itself, a cheerful white building with a red roof. There were letters from relatives who had moved away, describing life in California and Oregon and New York, always ending with a longing for the prairie. There was a faded map of the Yellowstone Trail, the route that had once connected the Great Lakes to the Pacific, and Bentley was marked on it as a dot, a stop along the way. Harold pointed to the map and said that his father had driven that route every year to visit his brother in Montana. He said the road was not just a path from one place to another, it was a thread that wove families together, that kept them connected even when they were far apart. I asked him if he ever felt like leaving, like the young people who had gone. He looked out at the grain elevator, at the empty houses, at the sky that seemed to go on forever. He said he thought about it sometimes, especially in the winter, when the cold was bitter and the isolation pressed in. But he said that the land had a way of holding you, of making you feel like you belonged to it. He said that when he walked the old road, even though it was now just gravel and grass, he could still feel the presence of his ancestors, their footsteps mixing with his own. He said that was something you could not find in a city or a suburb. It was a gift, and he was grateful for it. I stayed with Harold for a few hours, helping him with a small chore, mending a fence post that had come loose. The work was simple and satisfying, and as I drove the nails into the wood and stretched the wire, I felt a connection to the land that I had not expected. I thought about the generations of farmers who had done the same work, who had faced the same challenges, who had looked at the same horizon. The prairie was not just a landscape, it was a living thing, a presence that demanded respect and offered a quiet kind of peace. When I said goodbye to Harold, he gave me a copy of the map he had shown me, the one of the Yellowstone Trail. He said it might help me find my way, even though the road was gone. He smiled and said that the road was never really gone, not as long as someone remembered it. I thanked him and I drove away from Bentley, the grain elevator growing smaller in my rearview mirror until it was just a speck against the sky. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, and I knew I needed to find a place to stop for the night. I had been driving for several hours, and the gravel road had given way to a paved road again, a county highway that ran parallel to the old route. I saw a sign for a town called Dunn Center, and I decided to turn off and see if there was a place to stay. Dunn Center was a small town, but it was alive. There were people walking on the sidewalks, a grocery store with lights inside, a cafe with a neon sign that blinked open. I parked on the main street and went into the cafe. The air smelled of coffee and fried food, and there was a jukebox playing a country song I did not recognize. I ordered dinner, and the waitress smiled and asked where I was from. I told her I was following the old highway, the one that used to be the main road across the state. She nodded and said that her grandmother had told her stories about it, about the trips they took to see relatives, about the roadside attractions and the picnic spots. She said the highway was a part of her family's history, even though she had never driven it herself. I ate my meal and watched the townspeople come and go. There was a group of men at a corner table talking about farming, a woman with a baby in a stroller, a teenager on his phone. The world was moving forward, and the old road was fading into memory. But the stories were still there, in the conversations, in the photographs, in the minds of those who remembered. I finished my coffee and paid the check. The waitress told me that there was a small motel down the street, the Prairie Inn, and that the owner was a man who knew a lot about the area's history. She said I should talk to him if I was interested in the old highway. I walked to the motel, a low building with a neon sign that flickered and hummed. The owner, a man named Tom, was at the desk. He was in his 50s with a kind face and a graying beard. I told him what I was doing, and his eyes lit up. He said he had grown up in the area, and he remembered when the old road was still used by some of the older residents, those who refused to give up the drive. He said his grandfather had been a truck driver, hauling goods along the highway before the interstate was built. He opened a drawer and pulled out a black and white photograph of his grandfather standing next to a truck, the road stretching behind him into the distance. The truck was old and dusty, but the man in the photograph was smiling, as if he had just accomplished something great. Tom gave me a key to a room, and I settled in for the night. The room was simple, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. I lay on the bed and thought about the day, about Mary and Harold and the waitress and Tom, about all the people who had shared their stories with me. The forgotten highway was not a road of asphalt and gravel. It was a road of connections, of shared memories, of human lives. It had been a lifeline for generations, and even though it was now mostly gone, its spirit remained in the people who remembered it. The next morning, I woke early and drove out of Dunn's Center, heading south on a county road that followed the approximate path of the old highway. The countryside changed, growing slightly more rolling, with hills that rose and fell like gentle waves. I came to a river, the Little Missouri, and I stopped at a bridge that crossed it. The bridge was old, made of concrete and steel, and it had a sign that said it was built in 1922. I got out and looked at the river, at the water that flowed slow and brown, at the trees that lined the banks. I imagined the cars of the 1920s crossing this bridge, their tires humming on the concrete, their drivers marveling at the view. The bridge was still strong, still solid, a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era. I drove on, and the road began to climb into the Badlands, the landscape turning dramatic and strange. The hills were layered with bands of red and brown and gray, and the rocks looked like the bones of the earth. The road twisted and turned, following the contours of the land, and I could feel the difficulty that the early travelers must have faced. This was not an easy road. It was a road that demanded attention, that required care. But it was also a road of beauty, of grandeur, of a scale that humbled the soul. I stopped at a scenic overlook, a small pullout with a sign that described the history of the highway in the Badlands. It said that the road had been carved out of the rock by hand, by crews of men using shovels and dynamite. It said that the road had been a vital link for the communities in the region, connecting them to the rest of the country. It said that the road was now abandoned, but that its legacy lived on in the stories of those who had traveled it. As I stood there, looking out at the Badlands, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was grateful for the road, for the journey, for the people I had met. I was grateful for the forgotten highway, for the way it had opened up the past and made it present. I knew that I was not the first person to stand on this spot and feel awe, and I would not be the last. The road was a thread that tied us all together, across time and space, and I was part of that thread now. I got back in my car and drove on, the Badlands unfolding around me like a dream. The sun was high, the sky was clear, and the road was empty. I drove for hours, lost in thought, until I came to a town called Medora, a tourist town that had embraced the history of the region. Medora was busy, with shops and restaurants and a museum dedicated to the life of Theodore Roosevelt, who had ranched in the area in the 1880s. I visited the museum, and I learned about the Rough Riders, the open range, the cattle drives. I learned about the stagecoach routes that had preceded the highway, about the trains that had once carried passengers across the prairie. The museum had an exhibit on the old highway, with photographs and maps and a mock-up of a gas station from the 1930s. I stood in front of the exhibit and felt a connection to the road, a sense of continuity that was both humbling and inspiring. As I left the museum, I saw a man sitting on a bench, reading a book. He was older, with a beard and a hat, and he looked up as I passed. He asked if I was enjoying my visit, and I said I was. I mentioned that I was following the old highway, and his face broke into a smile. He said his name was Bill, and he had written a book about the highway, a history of the route from the Mississippi to the Rockies. He pulled a copy out of his bag and handed it to me. He said it was a labor of love, a collection of interviews and photographs and maps that told the story of a road that had been forgotten. I thanked him, and I sat down next to him, and we talked for an hour about the road, about the people who had traveled it, about the places they had seen. Bill told me that the highway was more than just a piece of infrastructure. It was a symbol of the American spirit, of the desire to explore, to connect, to build something new. He said that the road had been built by people who believed in the future, who believed that the prairie could be tamed, that the distances could be conquered. He said that the road was a monument to that belief, even though it was now crumbling and overgrown. He said that the best way to honor the road was to remember it, to tell its stories, to keep its spirit alive. I bought a copy of Bill's book, and I promised to read it. Then I got in my car and drove on, leaving Medora behind. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. I found a place to pull over, a gravel turnout on a hill that overlooked the Badlands. I got out and sat on the hood of my car, watching the sky change colors. The wind was blowing and the grass was rustling, and the world was quiet and vast and beautiful. I thought about the road, about all the people I had met, about all the stories I had heard. I thought about Mary and Harold and Tom and Bill, about Eleanor and the old man in Washburn. I thought about the forgotten highway, and I realized that it was not forgotten at all. It was remembered in the hearts and minds of the people who had lived along it, who had traveled it, who had loved it. The road was gone, but it was not forgotten. It was alive in every story, in every photograph, in every memory. I stayed there until the stars came out, until the sky was a canopy of lights that stretched from horizon to horizon. Then I drove on, following the road that was no longer a road, following the thread of memory and history and human experience. I drove into the night, knowing that the journey was not about reaching a destination. It was about the road itself, about the moments of connection, about the wind and the sky and the stories that we carry with us from one life to the next, from one forgotten highway to the next. And as the miles passed beneath my wheels, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I drove on through the night, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the dark. The road was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the tires and the whisper of the wind. I passed through small towns that were barely more than clusters of lights, their main streets quiet and still. I thought about the people who lived there, about the lives they led, about the ways in which the old highway had shaped them. The road was a thread, and I was following it to its end. As the hours passed, the sky began to lighten, a deep blue giving way to pale gray and then to pink. I pulled over at a rest area near the Montana border, a simple plot of gravel with a picnic table and a sign that marked the crossing of the old highway. I got out and walked to the sign. It was weathered and faded, the letters nearly worn away by years of wind and sun. It read State Highway 8, end of route. Below that, in smaller letters, Historic US 8-5. I stood there looking at the sign, and I felt a strange sense of completion. This was the place where the forgotten highway faded into the prairie, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and then to grass. Beyond this point, the road continued as a county road, then as a dirt track, then as nothing at all. The map showed no continuation. The highway simply ended. I sat on the picnic table and watched the sunrise. The light crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The Badlands were behind me, and ahead was a vast, flat plain that stretched into Montana. The sky was enormous, a dome of orange and gold that seemed to swallow the earth. I thought about the travelers who had come this way, the families in their Model Ts, the truck drivers hauling goods across the continent, the tourists heading west to the national parks. They had all reached this point, and they had all felt the same sense of boundary, the same awareness that the road they had followed was a line between one world and another. I pulled out the book Bill had given me and flipped through the pages. There was a photograph of a gas station from the 1920s, a simple wooden building with 2 pumps and a sign that said "Last Stop Before Montana." The caption explained that the station had been operated by a man named Carl, who had served travelers for more than 40 years. I wondered what Carl had thought about as he watched the cars pass, as he filled their tanks and gave them directions. He must have seen thousands of faces, heard thousands of stories. He must have known the road as well as anyone. I closed the book and looked around. The rest area was deserted. There was no sound but the wind and the distant cry of a bird. I felt a profound solitude, but it was not loneliness. It was the solitude of being a witness, of standing at the edge of something old and vast and meaningful. The forgotten highway was not just a road. It was a memory, a living thing that existed in the minds of those who had known it, and now I was one of those people. I got back in my car and turned around, heading east. The journey was not over. It had simply reached a point of reflection. I drove back through the towns I had passed, the landscape looking different in the morning light. The colors were sharper, the distances clearer. I stopped at a diner in a small town called Scranton, where I ordered breakfast and talked to the waitress. She was young, in her 20s, and she told me that her grandmother had driven the old highway to visit family in Montana. She said her grandmother loved the road, loved the way it wound through the hills and over the rivers. She said she wished she could have seen it in its prime. I paid my bill and left. As I walked to my car, I noticed a cluster of mailboxes at the edge of the parking lot. They were old, some of them rusted, with names painted or carved into the metal. I read them: Anderson, Peterson, Schmidt, Olson. Names that had been on the land for 100 years, names that were woven into the history of the road. I imagined the letters that had been delivered along the highway, the news from faraway places, the connections that had been sustained by a strip of asphalt. I drove on, and by midday I reached the Missouri River again, crossing a modern bridge that hummed with traffic. I thought about the old bridge I had seen the day before, the one near the Badlands. I thought about the thousands of crossings that had taken place over that river, the journeys that had begun and ended on its banks. The road was gone, but the river remained, a constant witness to change. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, I found myself on a stretch of the old highway that had been preserved, a few miles of asphalt that had been left as a historic byway. I pulled over and got out. The asphalt was cracked and weathered, but it was still there. I knelt down and placed my hand on the surface. It was warm from the sun, rough and worn. I closed my eyes and listened. I heard the wind, the distant sound of a tractor, the cry of a hawk, and beneath those sounds I imagined the echoes of tires, of voices, of laughter and tears. The road was silent now, but it had once been alive. I stayed there until the light began to fade, until the shadows grew long and the sky turned to violet. Then I stood up, brushed the dust from my hands, and walked back to my car. I turned and looked at the road one last time. It was just a strip of asphalt, faded and cracked, overgrown with weeds. But it was also a story, a long, winding story that had been told in 1,000 voices. And I had been lucky enough to hear some of them. I got in the car and drove away, heading back toward the interstate, back toward the world of speed and convenience. But I carried the forgotten highway with me. I carried the faces of the people I had met, the words they had spoken, the photographs they had shared. I carried the memory of a road that was no longer on the map, and I knew that I would never look at a map the same way again. Every line, every dot, every trace of a vanished route held a story. Some stories were forgotten, some were waiting to be told. The forgotten highway was gone, but its spirit was not lost. It lived on in the wind, in the prairie grass, in the hearts of those who remembered. And as I merged onto the interstate, the headlights of other cars streaming past, I smiled. Because I knew that somewhere, on a gravel turnout in the Badlands, or on a cracked stretch of asphalt near the Montana line, the old road was still there, still waiting, still whispering to anyone who cared to listen. And the journey, I realized, would never really end. It would just keep going, from one story to the next, from one road to the next, forever and ever.